I'm sure that everybody has read our report, our stock take report, and so you know by heart that there are three dynamics feeding the process of greening the finance: commitments of factors, market dynamics, innovations, and supervision and regulation. The next panel is going to make the state of the art on this third issue, and I'm happy to invite Sylvie GOULARD, who will Deputy Governor of the Banque de France, who will introduce her guests and speakers.
So thank you, everybody, to be here. Good morning. Yes, I'm glad to have the opportunity to invite central bankers and supervisors, because they are not always considered being on the side of the one helping, but we do our best, definitely. This afternoon you will have a speech by François Villeroy-de-Galhau, the governor of the Banque de France. And last year he launched during the One Planet Summit a network we are very proud of, I must say, called NGFS, so the Network for Greening the Financial System. It is chaired by Frank Elderson from the Dutch Central Bank, and it is a club of willing trying to do the very, I must say, difficult work we have to provide to invent the right criteria to look at the green products offered by the financial sector, to improve the way we can streamline the supervision of the financial institutions. So I'm very glad that this initiative, and as I only arrived at the bank in January, I pay tribute to the one conceiving the initiative and the ones, some of them being present, making it lively and efficient. But the amazing result is the success of this initiative, because within 1 year we moved from 8 funding members to 21 members, 5 observers. We have participants from all the continents, which is very important in our eyes, because it's a global issue, and we have absolutely to include developing countries. We have Mexico, we have Morocco, we have China, and also countries that are facing very different stages in their own development. I'm glad also to underline the fact that we are working very closely with the European Commission. The European Commission also took a great initiative during last year with the work on the taxonomy. The College of Commissioners should announce today a proposal to be carbon neutral in 2050. And of course I insist, and this is a recommendation of our friend from Mexico, Rafael, who is not in the panel, but we are inclusive because it's part of sustainability to be inclusive. So I speak on his behalf by saying that the network is on greening finance, so climate is all, of course, at the heart of our work, but it goes also beyond, and we have to take into consideration all the risks related to pollution, air pollution, water pollution, etc. And the NGFS has already produced an interim report. We were in Bali for the IMF meetings with some of the members of the network, and they will deliver a first comprehensive report in April, so within less than 1 year, a little bit more than 1 year, a great job has been achieved. But now let me introduce you to the panelists. I have the pleasure to invite Sarah. Sarah Breeden is Executive Director for International Bank Supervision at the Bank of England and the PRA. Sarah, hello, welcome.
Thank you.
You have the oversight of the Bank of England's work enhancing the financial system's resilience to climate change. And you are not only a member of the steering committee of the NGFS, you are chairing the work stream number 2 on dedicated to microfinancial issues, and you will tell us what is it about. Maintenant, je vais passer au français pour.
I am now going to switch to French. You can take a seat. And I'm delighted that
And is also to have more diversity. Je vais appeler Monsieur Abderrahim Bouaza à venir parmi nous, qui s'exprimera en...
I am now going to call Abraham Bouaza. He will speak French, but I think you have access to simultaneous interpretation. He's the general manager of the Banque Al Maghrib. He took part in an ambitious plan to ensure that the Moroccan financial system is in line with the SDGs.
Because we are very proud that the Moroccans are part of the steering committee, and he is participating notably in the work stream number 1 dedicated to the supervisory issues. Donc j'étais en train de dire que vous occupiez du work.
I was just saying that you were in charge of the number 1 work stream on supervision.
Luis Pereira, bienvenue.
Luis Pereira, welcome. Luis.
But he's at home in France, donc merci Louise d'être parmi nous. You were an observer, the BIS is observer at the steering committee of the NGFS. You know, the BIS is the mother of the central banks, and we are glad to have you. You are involved in all work streams, and you will provide specific insight on green finance research perspective. Now I'm inviting Dave Jones. Hi, Dave. Dave made a long trip from California to be here, but we are very happy to have American willings with us, to put it this way. He comes from the California Department of Insurance. You are in charge. You were pioneer of the climate risk carbon initiative you launched on the exposure of the Californian insurance sector, which is, by the way, the first one in the US, to climate risk. So we are very glad to have you here, not only to speak from America, but also to give us the view of the insurers who can play a big role in the transition. And last but not least, Danielle, please join us. You are the Group Head of Strategy and Global Head of Sustainable Finance at HSBC, so it's the banking sector and not the insurance one. Well, a few words on the process and timing. We will have 2 rounds of questions for each panelist. You will have only roughly 5 minutes each. For one reason, we want to make it as interactive as possible, so do not hesitate, above all in the second round, to also answer to the previous comments or to react to them. And thank you so much, all of you, for your attention. Abderrahim, je disais que le deuxième round de...
I was actually saying that we will try to make the second round of questions interactive between panelists.
Macro-financial work stream, what is the state of play and what are the deliverables we can expect for April, giving us, of course, the view of the Bank of England. We all remember Mark Carney's speech in 2015 on the tragedy of Horizon. I remember at that time I was in a previous life, but I was at the European Parliament. And I remember many people say, whoa, a central banker dealing with these issues. So please, from England, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I too remember Governor Carney's first intervention back in 2015, when he very clearly said that the Bank of England thought that climate change brought financial risks to the institutions that we supervise, and these issues were therefore core to our mandate. Those risks come from physical risks and transition risks. I don't need to tell an audience here about that. But what I did want to emphasize was that the risks are wide-ranging. They don't just come from the obvious things like weather-related insurance events. It could include mortgages to houses that are on floodplains. Transition risk is not just about fossil fuels. It's about energy efficiency of buildings and how we travel. So we've been clear for a while that climate change presents financial risks, but it's a global challenge that requires global solutions, and therefore when we were asked to join the network for the greening of the financial system, frankly it was a no-brainer that we were going to join. It's an important forum where we can share best practice and learn from each other, and so support the greening of the financial system that is required. And I do want to commend the Banque de France leadership on that topic. I chair Workstream 2. The aim of Workstream 2 of the NGFS is to develop an analytical framework to size the economic and financial risks that climate change creates. Our aim is to set out what we already know, but also we'll be setting out where there are gaps in our knowledge. And I did want to emphasize a point that you just made, that this is hard, right? We have to translate climate science into macroeconomic outcomes and translate macroeconomic outcomes into financial risks that the firms that we supervise, like Daniel, face. And that is a complex intellectual challenge. And so one of the things that we are considering doing and publishing as part of the Workstream 2 is a simplified version of that. Rather than trying to understand the risks in the myriad of possible climate pathways we face, let's set out a few scenarios that people can understand. Has a transition happened or not? Is the transition orderly or not? And then people could use that to understand the risks to their business. And that is vital, in our opinion, because it's understanding those future risks that we will face that creates the impetus for action now. It's the way of breaking the tragedy of the horizon that Governor Carney says. Scenario analysis makes that tragedy of the horizon real. We don't have to wait for the climate-related risks to materialize. We can paint a future picture of those risks and realize we need to act now. So if there's one thing that I hope that our Workstream 2 delivers, it's that case for action, helping people understand that climate change is a risk that needs to be managed now, not in 2040.
Thank you. Thank you for being so clear and so brief. So I can move to Abderrahim. Sarah a utilisé les mots to translate. Donc c'est bien aussi que je vous passe la parole en français. Je crois que pour le climat, on a à franchir beaucoup de barrières. Et ces barrières, elles sont mentales. Elles sont entre les scientifiques et les financiers. Elles sont entre ce qu'on appelle le Nord et le Sud. Elles sont entre des sociétés qui ont des industries plus développées et d'autres qui rejoignent un autre stade avec beaucoup aussi de volonté de rattrapage tout à fait légitime. Donc comment vous voyez cette urgence d'un pays qui est jeune, qui est dynamique, dont l'économie veut prendre toute sa place dans le jeu mondial?
Merci pour cette invitation. Je dois tout d'abord dire que le Maroc, dans le cadre de l'accord de Paris, il a pris quand même des engagements très, très ambitieux. Donc, tant sur le plan de l'atténuation des risques climatiques, en visant un taux de 52% du mix énergétique provenant des énergies renouvelables, que sur le plan de l'adaptation pour les secteurs vulnérables, tels que le secteur de l'agriculture, le secteur de la pêche ou le secteur de l'eau. Et donc le Maroc, il est d'autant plus vulnérable à ces enjeux climatiques, de par sa position géographique, qu'il y a des secteurs qui souffrent beaucoup plus que d'autres de cette vulnérabilité. Donc le secteur agricole, par exemple, représente 12% du PIB et emploie presque 40% donc, de la main-d'œuvre. En plus de ça, le Maroc il est dépendant de l'énergie importée. Donc 95% de l'énergie consommée au Maroc donc, elle est importée. Et donc, tout cela fait que la Banque centrale, bien sûr, s'est résolue à accompagner les engagements du gouvernement. Et donc, il a élaboré une feuille de route avec le secteur financier, avec les régulateurs du secteur financier, pour aligner le secteur sur les enjeux du développement durable. Donc, bien sûr, on se heurte à certaines difficultés. L'application de cette feuille de route n'est pas facile. Il y a beaucoup de questions complexes qui se posent pour appliquer cette feuille de route. Par exemple, très difficile d'identifier ce qui est actif vert, ce qui est actif dit brun. Quels indicateurs, quels moyens de mesure de risque il faut mettre en place pour mesurer les risques adjacents à ces actifs et quelle approche adopter pour gérer et maîtriser ces risques. Donc, le fait que nous soyons dans le réseau GNFS, pour nous, c'est une opportunité pour le secteur financier pour progresser dans l'appréhension et la gestion des risques liés au climat, et donc aussi pour développer le financement durable et la transition vers une économie verte. Donc, nous avons un accès privilégié aux études et toutes les recherches effectuées par ce réseau, mais aussi nous contribuons par le partage des informations que nous recueillons auprès du secteur financier sur les politiques de finances durables. Nous partageons ces informations avec les membres et nous donnons aussi nos avis sur les questions posées d'une perspective d'un pays de la rive sud de la Méditerranée qui a ses propres spécificités. Voilà.
Très bien, merci beaucoup. Effectivement, je crois qu'il y a un accord sur la complexité des matières, comme Sarah l'avait dit. Je trouve intéressant que vous insistiez sur le secteur agricole, dont souvent on parle un petit peu moins. On parle beaucoup du transport, on parle beaucoup de l'énergie, de l'habitat. Mais je crois que l'agriculture est un domaine qui est vraiment important, qui, comme vous l'avez dit, dans votre pays, touche beaucoup de main-d'œuvre en plus, mais qui est aussi important pour, je dirais, les imaginaires collectifs. En tout cas, c'est très net dans un pays comme la France et si on veut toucher l'ensemble du territoire. Alors peut-être à un niveau moins concret, moins ancré dans la terre. I give the floor to Louis, who's coming from the BIS. You are not in the agriculture. What can be your contribution from Basel?
Okay, thank you. Merci, merci Sylvie. Yes, we, as you know, the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, is the so-called central banks for central banks. So we try, of course, to participate in the network. It's an excellent initiative. But let me perhaps preface this by one observation. For those who are still, I mean, not in this room, I believe, but those who are still skeptical about the damage done by climate change, we are in the land of Blaise Pascal. And if you don't still believe, despite the piling of evidence of the damage done by climate change, think of my suggestion taking a pari pascalien, in the sense that it's a very small insurance policy against extremely gigantic risks and consequences that you might have in the future. So by a small, and think of this as a purely selfish risk management strategy, by undertaking measures and undertaking activities that are combating climate change, a small insurance policy for very huge rewards in the future, as much as Pascal was suggested that believing in God was also bringing, despite a small sacrifice in your life, big rewards for those who think of eternal life in heaven. I'm not saying that this is the same issue, but the concept of using game theory to justify what we are doing, even if we're, of course, not a true believer in the scientific evidence, which I'm not. I am a perfect believer in what the scientific evidence is worth doing. So at the BIS, we convene many central banks regularly. Sylvie comes with other colleagues here that I see in the room on a regular basis. And I think let's perhaps dismiss the idea that central banks, like when you have a very, very big problem, you call the cavalry and it's going to solve all problems, particularly this big one of events related to climate change. Central banks, my personal feeling, will contribute to participating in what many, many actors, and we've seen some of them this morning and throughout these days, engage in an array of complex policies that all converge towards combating climate change: tax policies, credit finance policies, research, fiscal policies. And the instruments and the array of instruments that need to be used in order to achieve our common goal are multiple. The usage of these multiple instruments, as we know, are complicated, because what you want to engineer with these policies, these transitions policies towards a low-carbon economy, needs to be done through what the economists in their jargon call Pareto optimal types of interventions, which means essentially that what we are doing on a daily basis should benefit everyone and not have any type of loser. And as we know, and as I think Secretary of State Brune Poisson was saying this morning, it's complicated. It's complicated because the transfers that are necessary to achieve a policy that left no one's behind in this transition, if you look at the array of instruments, tax, credit, and so on and so forth, are a complicated endeavor. So central banks can contribute to that. They are not necessarily going to solve all the problems, and you have to arbitrage between those who have to be compensated, for example, in less developing countries. Abderrahim was talking about the difficulties of a young economy that needs to grow fast. I think we have here Mahjong, our colleague from the NGFS, where the PBOC is taking actions towards having a growth content that lowers the carbon footprint. So many initiatives have to accommodate the conflicting interests of those who want to move, but those also that has to bear the cost of this transition. And the most difficult part is to engineer something where the perception of the cost of the transitions are equally shared among all actors in society. So having said that, central banks can contribute to play a role, because among the mandates that they have increasingly, particularly after the global financial crisis, is financial stability. And we all know that the events that we are talking about here, in terms of catastrophic storms, in terms of floods, in terms of wildfires, affect obviously the financial industry through the costs of these events, the cost of destruction. And particularly, for example, the insurance industry and even the banking industry. So these events can be so serious that they can threaten at some point in time the financial stability of our financial systems. And therefore, in that particular with that particular angle, central banks do have the responsibility to take action, to understand exactly what are the consequences of that, what are the preventive measures, and they are doing so in a variety of ways: stress testing their banks, doing research, linking these events through a macroeconomic model, like Sarah was saying. So even if we are not, let's say, the primary actor of these transformations, even if we understand that the political economy complications of engaging to combating climate change are are complex, I think we need to take our part, and we are doing so in this network.
So thank you, Luis. Very important indeed to underline the stability mandate of the central banks and to underline the importance of having the Asian economies with us and China in the steering group of the NGFS, because it's of such a magnitude, the possible impact of big economies, that we have to be aware of that. So now let's move to the insurance sector and to the US. How do you see the evolution? As you launched your own initiative some years ago, we can observe some movements and awareness. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Finance for Tomorrow for inviting me to participate on the panel. Just a background note, in the United States, insurers are regulated at the state level. Each state has an insurance supervisor and leads a department of insurance. In California, we have the largest insurance market in the United States, where insurers have $5.5 trillion in assets under management and collect about $300 billion a year in premium. And I applaud the central banks and bank supervisors for forming the NGFS. I think it's a tremendous important step, and one that reflects the important role that regulatory supervisors can play in leading with regard to trying to make sure that their regulated entities are appropriately addressing climate risk and also taking advantage of opportunities presented as we transition away from a carbon-based economy. In California, since 2011, I've been leading a small group of other state regulators in surveying insurance companies that represent about 80% of the US market by premium volume, surveying them with regard to how they're responding to climate risk in their underwriting, their reserving, and their business operations. It was important to me that the survey be mandatory, that the companies be required to answer these questions, and that the results be publicly disclosed. And I think those are two principles that have guided my supervision as it relates to climate risk and the insurance sector. So we perform the survey annually. The results are published. It provides us greater insight into how various segments of the insurance sector in the United States are responding or not responding to climate risk. Very quickly, based on those survey results, I reached a conclusion in 2016 that US insurers were not paying enough attention to transition risk, particularly with regard to its implications for their capital and reserves. I also concluded that a particular asset, thermal coal, had a very high potential or risk of becoming a stranded asset, so I took two steps in 2016. One, I asked the insurance companies I regulate to divest from thermal coal, and second, I required them to specifically disclose their investments in oil, gas, and coal and utilities that rely on carbon for more than 50% of their electricity generation. Moving forward, of course, some of the tools available to the financial sector as well as regulators have gotten better and evolved in a positive way. And so picking up on the recommendation of the TCFD, just this year, we engaged with a French modeling firm, 2 Degree Investing Initiative, to perform climate risk scenario analysis on the portfolios of the 600 largest insurance companies in the United States, and prepared detailed scenario analysis reports for each of these companies, which we provided to the company's leadership and asked that they consider it as they're making investment decisions. We also aggregated that analysis in a report we published that looks at the insurance sector overall. Suffice it to say that based on the results of that analysis, insurance companies' investment in thermal coal is misaligned with a 2-degree scenario, which confirmed my decision in 2016 to ask them to divest from coal. They're better aligned in terms of their oil and gas investments, misaligned with regard to the automotive sector, underinvested in renewables, and so there's a lot of insights to be gleaned from this sort of approach. Importantly, too, in 2016, a group of international insurance regulators came together to form the Sustainable Insurance Forum, which, like the NGFS, is a working group for insurance regulators concerned about sustainability in insurance generally, but in particular concerned about climate risk. And it's a way for insurance supervisors to share best practices and learn from one another and develop approaches to addressing these issues, much as you're doing with the NGFS. We prepared an important joint issues paper with the International Association of Insurance Supervisors last year that maps various approaches that insurance supervisors are using to the IAS insurance core principles, which are sort of the DNA of insurance supervision. We submitted a very lengthy comment letter to the TCFD report when it was in draft. We fully supported the final recommendations of TCFD. This year we've undertaken, as a part of our work stream, surveying our members, insurance supervisors, with regard to the take-up of the TCFD recommendations by insurers and by supervisors, with an eye towards preparing another joint paper with the IAS that looks at the TCFD recommendations and how to make them more concrete, if you will, and more operational from the standpoint of insurance supervision. Finally, we've put together a very, very helpful question bank that insurance supervisors and examiners can use as they are examining insurance companies' responses to in consideration of climate risk. So I applaud you for forming the NGFS. We found creating a similar forum for insurance supervisors internationally incredibly important and useful. We have representation from developed and developing countries, from each of the continents. We have over 20 members now, and I would encourage folks interested in this area to go to the Sustainable Insurance website, where a number of our reports have been published, which are very helpful.
Thank you so much, Dave. So networking the networks. Daniel, last but not least, you are the only one from the banking sector on this panel. How do you see the last developments in this field, the awareness? How can we work closely together in order to get the right finances?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on that panel. For those that don't know the IAF is essentially the International Banking and Insurance Association, and we see ourselves in this case as the partner of NGFS on the private sector side. We formed a Sustainable Finance Working Group. We have about 80 banks in that working group now. Most of the large names from the US, Europe, and Asia are part of that group, so to really have a global counterpart. Three observations that I would like to share. First of all, TCFD, which is obviously a private sector-driven initiative, and the increasing attention of regulators, I think, have been really game changers. It allowed climate risk and climate change to move to the board level of every organization, and that's really what we want to achieve. So the fact that now regulators are asking questions, the fact that we are putting statements and numbers out in the public domain means that every chairman, every CEO, every audit committee, every risk committee needs to be aware of this. And you all know that that immediately leads to a lot of questions, because a lot of people realize that the information we are about to make public isn't information that everybody understands. So I think that both the TCFD and the NGFS and the action of individual regulators have meant that this was moved out of something that was buried down in the organization to the very top of the house, and I think has been a great achievement over the last 12 to 18 months. You will now find, I think, every chairman of every major bank being able to stand this discussion, and I think it's very important. The second is that the discussion moved away from something that initially was very, I would say, reputational risk-driven, to now a very holistic approach. If you look at our organization, HSBC, but also what we heard earlier today in the keynote address, this is now becoming a normal way of running credit risk. We think about climate risk in the same way we think about geopolitical risk. What are the big cash flow implications that are coming down the line? Will the business model still be sustainable in 5, 7, 10 years from now? But also we look at physical risk. And as you said earlier, if we have a mortgage portfolio that is lying low, is that actually a risk that will materialize? And I think that is very important. So we moved us away from a very narrow discussion about brand into something that really goes all across the risk management framework. And I think that is true for most of the major banks that are involved in this. And I think that the third, and that's really important, and we discussed this just a few days ago, a lot of work has started on getting the data right. We have to move away from this discussion that is green versus brown. It's a very easy discussion to talk about renewables versus coal, and it's a very important discussion, but 95% of the economy is somewhere in between. And getting the data right and understanding where our clients are on that transition journey is incredibly important. In the steel sector, the cement industry, shipping, automotive, we need to understand for each and every one of our client, where on that journey are they, and then over time, move more capital to those that are on the move, and move risk away from those that we think are not on the move, and reflect that in pricing. So a lot of the work at the moment is ongoing in how do you actually embed climate risk in your day-to-day credit risk management. We heard a great example earlier today. We're doing the same, but I tell you, it's hard work because the data that is public is just not very good. So it is an action that we have to do together with the real economy to make this much better and then have a much more informed discussion about transition rather than just green and brown.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for these very clear points. And I've noticed that you mentioned, first of all, about the hard work to do on data and metrics, etc. But also there is an element of disclosure and how can the public authorities help the market to better analyze and with the pressure of the citizens maybe also get it right. So Sarah, could you tell us more on this supervisory task? What can the supervisors do better in order to capture the risk and to give better information to the public?
Thank you, Sylvie. And let me talk through a supervisory statement that the Bank of England has recently published. I should emphasize that it is a proposed approach to managing climate risks because it's out for consultation, and Daniel, I'm sure, will be sending me his comments on what he thinks is good and bad about the statement. But I do think it's a helpful way of trying to embed risk management of these risks in the private sector. And it's important for us to do it because our experience, based on the conversations we had with firms, was that while a majority of firms were treating climate risks as a financial risk, they had moved from the reputational and corporate and social responsibility box into...
May I interrupt you? Are you talking about financial firms, or do you include the corporates in your surveys and reflections?
So we were talking to the financial firms, but to be fair, one of the big themes that came back, and I think it goes to the point Daniel was making, was that in order for the banks and the insurers to understand the risks they face, they need good disclosure from their clients. And so one of the things that we're doing in our supervisory statement is making it very clear that we expect banks and insurers to be managing these risks. So it creates an obligation on those banks and insurers to go to their clients and say, I need this information. It is a regulatory requirement that I need to understand how you are managing these climate-related financial risks so that I understand the financial risks that I'm facing. If I may, one thing that I think is really important is to understand why the financial risks that climate change presents are different. They're different, in our opinion, on 3 dimensions. First, they're far-reaching in breadth and in magnitude. They hit every customer, every line of business, every geography, and so the risks they pose are therefore likely to be larger, correlated, irreversible, and so therefore of a greater scale. So that's very important. The second thing that we think is important is to recognize these risks are eminently foreseeable. We don't know what combination of physical and transition risk we're going to face, but we do know we are going to face some risk. And so therefore that is something that needs to be managed now. And then the third thing, and this goes to the point I made earlier, these are risks that are determined by the actions that we take today. What future scenario we end up in depends on actions of governments, and as Louis talked, these are difficult and complicated, but they also reflect the actions that banks take, insurers take, and their customers and clients take. And what we're trying to do in the supervisory statement is use governance, risk management, scenario analysis, and disclosure to make sure all of those risks are managed in the right way.
No, thank you so much, Sarah. Maybe for the ones not listening in French, you can take the time to put your headphones. I'm going to move slowly to Abderrahim.
Vous avez
Mention a roadmap. Hein. Par exemple, est-ce que vous allez jusqu'à imposer un certain nombre de, je trouve mes mots en français, de disclosure, de publication. Est-ce que vous pensez que la bonne voie, c'est que les autorités publiques imposent un certain nombre de règles de manière à faire bouger les autorités? Est-ce que, par exemple, dans la loi française, on a, en tout cas dans un premier temps, invité les entreprises à rendre publiques certaines informations avec un système, comme on dit en bon français, de comply or explain, c'est-à-dire d'expliquer le cas échéant pourquoi elles ne respectent pas. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous en dire un peu plus sur les voies que vous avez vous-même choisies?
Oui, la feuille de route pour la finance verte, il a été élaboré à l'occasion de la COP 22 qui a été organisée à Marrakech. Et donc, on a tenu compte, bien sûr, dans le cadre de cette feuille de route, au moins de 3 éléments. Bien sûr, j'ai parlé tout à l'heure de la cible de 52% qu'il faut atteindre d'ici 2030. Donc, c'est très proche 2030. Donc, le fait que le Maroc n'est pas, ou il est un faible donc, émetteur des gaz à effet de serre, mais en même temps, il y a cette dégradation des sols et la raréfication des eaux qu'on constate en raison des enjeux climatiques. Donc, cette feuille de route, il a été, c'est des engagements volontaristes et volontaires de la part des institutions financières, donc il n'est pas imposé. Donc, c'est juste les institutions financières se sont mis d'accord sur les axes de cette feuille de route. Aujourd'hui, bien sûr, on constate que les choses progressent lentement. Les banques n'arrivent pas encore à changer leur modèle. Donc, il y a des initiatives qui ont été prises par-ci, par-là. Il y a des banques qui ont déjà intégré les risques liés aux enjeux climatiques dans leurs décisions de financement, d'investissement et dans le management des risques. Il y a l'autorité des marchés des capitaux qui a édicté un guide sur les green bonds et les premières émissions des obligations vertes au Maroc. Ils ont été faites à partir de 2016, donc il y a Casablanca Finance City aussi qui joue un rôle important dans la sensibilisation et dans la communication. Il est connecté à plusieurs institutions financières et non financières qui opèrent dans la finance verte. Voilà, donc à ce stade, je pense qu'au niveau de la Banque centrale, nous pensons qu'il est temps de passer à une autre phase. Et nous sommes en train de réfléchir avec le secteur bancaire. Nous avons engagé d'ailleurs la discussion avec le secteur bancaire sur un texte qui va être plus exigeant, donc qui va exiger des banques d'intégrer les enjeux climatiques dans leur gouvernance des risques et dans leur politique de financement, de définir leur politique d'appétence à ces risques et de mettre en place des approches pour gérer et maîtriser les risques et en plus de communiquer aussi sur leur politique de finances durables vis-à-vis du public. Dans ce sillage, l'autorité du marché de capitaux aussi il a publié pour consultation un texte qui exige des entreprises qui font appel public à l'épargne de publier annuellement un rapport sur tout ce qui est enjeux environnementaux, sociaux et sur la gouvernance des risques liés aux enjeux climatiques. Donc voilà, donc après une phase, je dirais, d'apprentissage, d'accompagnement des institutions financières, on est aujourd'hui à la veille de passer à une autre étape sans pour autant, pour le moment, demander aux banques, d'exiger des banques d'avoir dans leur portefeuille une partie des actifs verts par rapport, ça nous paraît quand même une question assez complexe pour aller à cet objectif pour le moment.
Et si j'ai bien compris ce que vous venez de dire, vous êtes plutôt favorable avec la conception un peu large que notre ami Raphaël de la Banque du Mexique nous disait tout à l'heure, qui est de dire le verdissement, le vert en général et pas seulement le climat, et peut-être même le durable qui inclut aussi des éléments alors plus difficiles à quantifier, mais à caractère social ou sociétaux, enfin sociaux ou sociétaux.
Tout à fait, nous sommes dans cette perspective et nous avons Regardez le premier rapport du NGFS, il va dans ce sens aussi. Et donc, nous sommes très inspirés par ce qui est fait au niveau des membres du NGFS, effectivement.
Très bien. Louise, you made a philosophical point. It would be very interesting to discuss on this because I read an article in Le Monde from an Australian philosopher, Clive Hamilton, underlying the fact that maybe people believe that something will happen with climate, but it is so dramatic. The magnitude of the risks is so big that many people, and I include myself, I mean, there are days where we want to do things, we are ready not to take the plane or not to drive or not to eat something, and then we realize is it going to be enough? So do you think that research, this is a very personal point, but do you think that research should include psychological elements or not? And then on research in general, what can you tell us? I know it's not the business of the BIS, but I don't resist, as you mentioned, Pascal. No, because I'm really serious on the fact that maybe we are not about to convince people if we don't understand the psychological keys.
No, you have a very important point, because implicitly, all of us here, because of the political economy difficulties of all that we're trying to do, at least we have a pari pascalien on the gradualist approach somehow, right? And perhaps you're absolutely right in saying that through research, you might point out that things are so important and so considerable in terms of challenges that you might need to sort of go beyond the gradualist approach, which is absolutely necessary, but perhaps not sufficient, and go for sort of more explicit measures where you do need to change the production and consumption patterns of our societies in a more sort of forceful way. Now, we know that this implies huge coordination, collective action problems. Like we know from Nobel Prize Elinor Ostrom that this is difficult. We know since the 60s with the work of Mancur Olson. Now, what could research inform us that would sort of begin convincing the general public? And research has to be not only top-notch research, but also the pedagogic explanation to the general public of what this is all about. You have another Nobel Prize winning through William Nordhaus about models, okay, of impact of climate change-related events into the macro. But it's still a sort of very general feeling about what is it that it will imply to me as an individual. You know stories about the impact on migration, for example, because floods in many developing countries will force migration into the rest of the world. So there are some narratives that I think are worth, when they are well documented by research, be pedagogically explained to the general public so that you remove a bit of this sensation of, okay, gradualism is okay, and let's sort of wait a little bit until things get a little bit worse before we act. So my suggestion, research needs to, and there is an array of topics, stranded assets, the way in which financial stability could be impacted, that we need to explain that will impact the daily life of citizens, and therefore we need to act now. We need to be a bit more than just take the casual gradualist approach towards combating climate change.
I see that Sarah is saying, is knowing, but don't you think, I provoke a little bit, don't you think that there is also the risk that then some people, as you say in England, will say, oh, it's project fear. You know, it's project fear, you only try to convince us through negative things. So I share your concerns. I'm just asking, because sometimes when you insist on the negative side, you lose part of the public opinion.
No, I think you can take perhaps also complement that with different types of research that will show all the things that are already happening. Take big data, for example. We have now on the brink of knowing, more or less, very detailed consequences in terms of the carbon footprint of individuals, right? And this could be, I mean, and we know all of us here that we do many things on our own that are gradual and that are positive. So perhaps research can try to say, your psychological question, maybe we can see what exactly is triggering this change in behavior at the individual level. What does it take without fear, just on the positive side, so that people can understand that the sum of their individual actions might be bigger than the whole. And that is a necessary idea to use research and big data research to make sure that people understand their local contribution is also as important as some of these big things that we are talking about.
Maybe if you don't mind, a swap, because Daniel wanted to say something?
Very quick addition to this. I completely agree, and I think that where we need to get to is personal impact. Because if we currently look at the whole sustainable finance industry, it is very much driven by governments and large institutional investors. We believe that sort of individuals really care, but we don't see it in their personal asset allocation. And partly it is because I think people don't understand what impact their personal asset allocation can actually have. So there's a lot of work, part of the UK Green Finance Task Force is, how do you explain to people their choices in their life insurance, their choices in their pension funds, their choices in their asset manager can actually have an impact, and what impact that is.
But they have to trust the system. And you said before that the data are not always reliable. So how do you...
That's true, but I think at the moment we don't even try to communicate impact. So we have started with our own pension fund now, which is aligned to Paris Agreement, to tell people the impact that their fund has in carbon reductions, in other SDGs, and suddenly people care. You get an email once a quarter and you say, okay, my money actually had an impact. Do you get that from any other investors? You don't. So I think I agree with the research, but research has to go one step beyond. You have to connect it with personal impact, and then hopefully individuals will actually move. Because at the moment, from the financial sector, we don't see the individuals actually voting with their money or putting their money where their mouth is.
Dave, do you share this vision from the US?
Well, I certainly share it from California.
Wow, applause!
and I really don't think rakes are a way to deal with climate change. So, we're running a real-time experiment in California with regard to the impact of climate change. And as I sit here, the campfire is now 100% contained, but it took 85 lives. There's still 290 people missing. It destroyed 18,000 structures, of which 13,800 were single-family homes. It's the most deadly and destructive fire in California history. The total losses of insured homes is double the 2017 fires in California. 2017 fires completely destroyed 6,800 homes and resulted in $12.6 billion US in insured losses. We're on track to exceed that and then some with these 2018 fires. So the climate scientists and climate impact modelers tell us that climate change has contributed to dry conditions, less precipitation, more frequent, more severe fires. We're now no longer having a fire season in California. It's year-round. And it has real consequences, So what do we do about that? Well, from an insurance sustainability perspective, it poses real challenges because insurers are rational economic actors, and they are free in California, as everywhere else in the United States, to choose to write or not write. And they are raising prices and deciding not to write insurance in the wildland-urban interface areas where you have about 1 million homes that are rated high or very high risk. So it's a challenge for regulators. We want those price signals, we want those availability signals to be sending signals to the real economy with regard to these risks. At the same time, we also want there to be insurance. So one area I think would be fruitful is better aligning the insurance products with improved behavior by communities and individuals with regard to mitigating or adapting to these growing climate-related catastrophic risks. What am I talking about? Well, there's a whole host of things that fire officials tell one should do to make your home more defensible. Impervious roofs, protecting the eaves of homes, defensible space. If you connected doing those things and meeting that standard with insurance availability, you would further incentivize people to do those things. Same things with communities taking actions as well. So I think there is some fertile ground to be plowed with regard to trying to align insurance availability as a product with changing behavior on the ground. But we have to go beyond that. What the other panelists talked about with regard to trying to reach a more broader set of the populace, not those that are just necessarily directly impacted by these catastrophic events, but everyone, to get people to understand that we all have something at risk. San Francisco, which typically has very clean air and doesn't have the same degree of fire risk as Northern California, nonetheless suffered from the Camp Fire. How? By haze and particulate matter blowing down into San Francisco and the Bay Area, where for about a 4-day period we had the worst air quality in the world in San Francisco. So even though the people in San Francisco don't face the same fire risk, they face health risks associated with these catastrophic weather events. So we've got to do more to persuade people that we're all in this together. They've got to make different individual decisions, and collectively, through our governments, we've got to do more faster and more aggressively to address this problem.
No, thank you, Dave. And we are very sorry for the people of California for all these terrible events. And it's not only to make the planet great again, it's to make it safe for the people when you lose so many lives. Daniel, you wanted to jump, and I think Abderrahim, or maybe, no, you wanted to say something? Yeah.
Réagir par rapport à cette question du comportement des personnes et de l'adhésion du public aux politiques de développement durable et aux politiques de finances durables. Donc je pense qu'il y a un facteur qui est quand même très important dans ce domaine, c'est l'inclusion financière. Parce que dans les pays en développement et émergents, l'inclusion financière n'atteint pas un niveau satisfaisant. Donc je parle du cas du Maroc, du cas du continent africain. En particulier pour le Maroc, nous avons relevé des disparités entre le monde urbain et le monde rural, mais aussi au niveau du genre. Et donc quand on veut mettre en place des politiques de finances durables, bien sûr, il faut réduire ces disparités, parce que c'est les populations qui ne sont pas incluses financièrement, c'est elles qui, et les populations pauvres, c'est elles qui subissent le plus les impacts des changements climatiques. Et donc c'est pour cela qu'au Maroc, nous sommes en train d'adresser ces questions. Et d'ailleurs, le gouvernement nous a suivis. Donc la Banque centrale a proposé une stratégie nationale d'inclusion financière. Elle a proposé d'abord au ministère des Finances. Et donc c'est une stratégie qui est en cours de validation et qui vise justement à réduire ces gaps que nous avons relevés suite à une étude qui a été faite.
Très bien. Et vous allez par exemple faire des actions d'éducation, de sensibilisation. La banque elle-même, parce que la Banque de France, par exemple, modestement, essaye de faire de l'éducation financière pour les personnes qui sont éloignées de notions de gestion de budget, mais aussi de notions économiques plus larges. Donc je ne sais pas ce que vous avez en tête.
Alors nous avons déjà une fondation pour l'éducation financière qui est pilotée par la Banque centrale avec plusieurs parties prenantes. Mais dans le cadre de cette stratégie, nous voudrions que c'est le gouvernement lui-même qui supporte aussi une partie de ces actions d'éducation financière, parce que nous, la Banque centrale ne peut pas couvrir toutes les populations et les régions. Donc effectivement, c'est la question de la finance durable, du développement durable, c'est des choses qui sont intégrées dans la stratégie de cette fondation marocaine pour l'éducation financière, mais un support du gouvernement à ce niveau, il est fortement souhaitable.
Merci. If you allow me, I would propose to give the floor for last 2-minute speech for each of you, and we do it in reverse order. So maybe, Daniel, you were the last one. Do you want to give a message before leaving?
Yeah, I think one of the topics I wanted to just briefly discuss is how do we work together, and what are sort of our expectations from also regulators? And I again had 3 points, and I think it's important for the wider discussion. One is we need to create global consistency. We all are part of so many initiatives, and if you listen to investors, and we run an annual investor survey, more than 80% of investors tell you that one of the biggest problems to invest more in sustainable finance is the inconsistency in taxonomy. So people are confused because there are so many labels now. And I think one piece of work we have to do together between private sector and regulators is to create more consistency, both in what we disclose and how we label it. A second topic I just wanted to mention again is data. And it's not just what data is available, but also I think we need to collectively create a rule book because you can interpret data in so many different ways. I give you a very simple example, a syndicated loan where 4 banks are in. What do? Do you take a quarter of that exposure? Do you take the full exposure you have because you support the certain activity? So I think there is a work to be done across the sector to create a rule book. And then the third, which I'm very passionate about, is we very quickly end up in a risk discussion. And it's very important because this is a major risk, but we need to find the balance between risk and opportunity. And regulation and the financial services sector have a big role to play in creating this opportunity. A great example is the work done in Basel. I think we need to think about what it means for long-term infrastructure, because a lot of the investments that we're talking about here will be 20, 30-year infrastructure projects, but banks have actually moved away from that sector. And I think we need to have that dialogue more. What does our joint relationship mean to actually create the opportunity and facilitate some of the financial flows? Thank you.
Maybe I abuse of my right. No, Dave, just 1 second. I wanted to give the floor to Louis as the regulation of banks was just mentioned. Do you take this back to Basel? This question: how can the banking regulations allow long-term financing?
Well, I think the idea of having an overall regulatory system that favors financial stability and taking that into account is the way forward. What we know is that the amount of investment that is necessary for this transition is huge. So it's not only regulating banks, but it's also creating incentives throughout our societies to make sure that all the vehicles for financing and investing in new technologies are geared towards this objective. So certainly, I think the fact that supervisors, regulators, central bankers are thinking about the way in which they can contribute to this is already a first sign that we are all geared towards this objective.
Yes, but I'm very American. We need to deliver now, not to talk. Dave?
Well, delivery is important. And so I think supervisors have a critical role to play in working with their regulated industries, in insisting on disclosure, in collaborating with the industry, whether it's the banking industry or the insurance industry, in developing better sources of data, providing strong signals from a regulatory standpoint that this is a uniform expectation that banks and insurance companies need to consider these risks and take actions to address them. I agree with the prior speakers about the importance of data, the need for more convergence with regard to how to identify and disclose these risks. I think that's critically important as well. I will say this, I think there's been some extraordinary leadership in the insurance sector. The insurance companies that have been on this stage and at this particular forum today in the last 2 days are making important strides. But there are large segments of the insurance industry, including large segments in the United States, which are lagging considerably behind. And we need to see more leadership on that front. And if it doesn't happen spontaneously, we need publics, consumers of these products, shareholders, investors, and asset managers who are holding interest in insurance companies to insist that these companies take up the recommendations of the TCFD and begin to more aggressively address these risks.
Thank you. Ibrahim? Un dernier mot venant du grand continent africain.
Parfait. C'est exactement mon message va dans ce sens. Je pense que le NGFS a pour vocation d'être un catalyseur des réflexions menées par les banques centrales et les superviseurs et de créer un lien avec les autres parties prenantes au plan international. Et donc, la Banque centrale souhaite être le relais de cette vocation. Tout à l'heure, je parlais de la feuille de route. J'ai omis de dire qu'il y a une dimension africaine. Une dimension africaine qui favorise une coopération avec les pays du continent. Donc, nous souhaitons capitaliser sur les relations très étroites avec les banques centrales africaines. Nous avons une dizaine d'accords de coopération qui couvre une vingtaine de pays africains. Et nos banques, nos principales banques sont présentes dans à peu près 26 pays africains. Et donc, voilà, nous souhaitons, donc, j'ai parlé tout à l'heure de Casablanca Finance City aussi, qui a un rôle important à jouer. Donc, nous souhaitons relayer un petit peu les messages et les travaux de NGFS vers nos collègues et les institutions concernées par ces questions.
Oui, transmettez-leur en effet toute notre disponibilité à échanger avec eux à travers votre truchement ou éventuellement directement, parce que je crois vraiment que cette inclusion de l'ensemble des pays, y compris des pays parfois les moins avancés ou ayant de grosses difficultés, elle est extrêmement importante. Ça n'est pas un enjeu seulement pour les pays les plus développés, avec surtout, comme ça a été évoqué aussi, des problèmes migratoires ou un impact, je dirais, physique sur des pays qui se trouvent dans des zones plus désertiques ou vivant exclusivement du produit de la pêche ou de choses comme ça. Sarah, last but not least.
Let me make 3 points. The first thing that I think is really important goes to your point, Sylvie. This issue requires action today, not discussion today. That's action by us as regulators, it's by the financial firms, and it is by their clients and customers. And we all need to take this transition in thinking that has happened and make it a transition in action. The second thing, to Daniel's point, this is about risk, but it is also about opportunities. The financing required to take us from the current world that we are in to a low-carbon world is enormous, and we need to do all we can to make that happen. And then the third thing is just to underline that this is a shared challenge. It's a shared challenge in terms of analytical frameworks, in terms of data, in terms of disclosure, in terms of developing innovative financing techniques. And it is the combination of the public and the private sector working together that I think will deliver the outcome that the planet needs.
Thank you so much. You said exactly what I wanted to say, so I'm going to save energy, which is also part of the job. Just add one word, we are maybe sometimes too pessimistic when we consider, well, the multilateralism is in danger, etc. We are now inventing another form of multilateralism where you don't only have the diplomats talking with each other, but where you have the private sector, where you have, and we had no NGOs here, but I know there are many in the room. We insisted on the necessity to have the citizens on board. So let's work. This was also one of the key words of this panel. We have a hard work to do, so the network will continue. Thank you so much.